Hello there, it's Andy Parks from the Washington Times, and I'll be joined by Stephen Dinan, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, right after this. You know, as a listener to my podcast, you qualify to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. That's right, simply go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. That's washingtontimes.com/ANDY. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Andy.
All right, Supreme Court weighs condemned killer's demand for pastor to touch him during execution. What a strange request. What do we know about this guy and what's he been convicted of?
So the conviction was for killing a convenience store worker. A guy was taking out the trash at a convenience store in Texas back 2004, and Ramirez stabbed him 29 times. Well, I guess had a couple of other accomplices as well. Stabbed the guy 29 times, part of a robbery, earning a total of $1.25 in the robbery, and it left the guy dead. Was convicted of that, faces a death penalty in Texas. Has been obviously challenging that death sentence in a number of different ways. And he was scheduled for execution in early September. And just before that execution, the Supreme Court put it on hold and said, well, we are going to decide this new claim. He argues that he has a religious right to have his pastor not just in the execution chamber, which Texas will now allow. There's been a back and forth over that, but Texas will now allow his own pastor to be in the execution chamber with him. But he says that the pastor needs to have his hands on him and be praying audibly over him. It turns out that there are some places where this is allowed. There's actually been a federal execution in the Trump administration where they resumed executions. There was an execution where there was touching and audible prayer. Alabama allows execution where there's touching. Texas, though, says that its execution chamber is so small, there's basically room for 3 people in the chamber. If the pastor is in there, it creates a security hazard, a risk that something could go wrong. And if there's one time when just for all reasons you do not want anything to go wrong, it's in the middle of a lethal injection execution. So Texas says no. We try and accommodate religious rights and religious practices. We've made the accommodation to allow the pastor to be in the chamber, but praying audibly is a distraction, and hands-on creates the possibility of other problems and the risk that, as I said yesterday, you're talking about a really difficult situation in some cases. That spiritual advisor or pastor or whoever the religious figure is in there, it could be a very good friend of the condemned person. And, who knows in that moment whether they might try and foil the execution. So that's what the court is weighing, is that desire for, basically a condemned man's last religious wish versus the state's claims that it needs to worry about the safety and propriety of this most solemn act.
Sounds almost like a stall tactic.
And there are certainly several justices who raised that exact issue, that the claim, and Texas actually claims that this request came so late in the process that they said that's pretty much the only way that you can look at this, is a stall tactic. But several of the justices actually raised the issue of, okay, if we allow this, what's next? That somebody's going to want to, a Catholic prisoner is going to want to receive communion in the execution chamber. Is somebody going to want to not just have a touch? This condemned person actually is okay with just having the pastor touching his foot, for example. But is the next person going to want to be hugged, embraced as the needle goes in? What's the next step after audible prayer? To have songs? The court wondered where are we going to draw lines here? What's the limiting principle to religious practice when it runs up against the state's desire to have an orderly and safe for everybody, as weird as that word sounds in this context, safe for everybody execution. So yes, what you put your finger on exactly. One of the concerns Justice Thomas in particular raised is whether this is being used and can be used as a stalling tactic. Justice Kavanaugh said, look, if we rule in favor of this defendant, if we rule in his favor, a lot of our docket is going to quickly become death row inmates making demands for religious accommodations and testing all of those different things we just talked about. Chief Justice Roberts had an interesting one. He said, what if there is a religion somebody's trying to convert at the last minute, and it takes, I'm Catholic, if you wanted to go through a confirmation process, it's a month-long process. Does the court have to accommodate that months-long process for conversion or confirmation before allowing the execution? You get into actual time, not literally just sort of presence in the execution chamber, but what about a religion where you have to wait a certain period of time? Does that trump the state's desire to have this or scheduled orderly execution? It's a tough case for the justices. There are a lot of analysts who figured that the way that the questions were going, the condemned person is not going to win this one.
Your next story is a fascinating one to me, as important now as it was then. Unknown soldier hits century mark with tributes and questions. I remember going there as a small child, and I didn't really remember the whole story, and I was reading your story yesterday. It brought back a lot of memories, and it really is something very special for Americans.
Yeah, Andy, this is every year I do I do a couple history stories throughout the year, and this one, they're always the favorite ones I do throughout the year. This one's definitely going to be my most favorite story of the year. And for anybody listening, if you have any interest in World War I history, the unknown, just sort of commemorations of American history, read the story, read whatever, read about the ceremonies that are going on to celebrate the 100th year mark of this body being returned. Everything about it, there's so many great details to it, with the way that the body was selected, the travails and actually floating the body, bringing the body back on water across from France to the U.S. The ship almost went down in a hurricane, the remnants of a hurricane, the last hurricane that basically smashed Tampa Bay, then went out into the Atlantic Ocean and almost took down the Olympia, the ship that was carrying the body. The Marine Honor Guard literally lashed themselves to the deck to stay on duty as the ship bobbed through this hurricane. I actually remember my father took me and my brothers in 1984. We were along the parade route. The body of the Vietnam era unknown was brought to Arlington. It was a very solemn ceremony. I remember watching the Marines actually lining the parade route. It was a hot Memorial Day, and they were standing. I'm not sure whether it was literally at attention, but they were standing at something close to that in a rigid posture, and began to take a toll. They started fainting left and right, and finally, Superior came by and allowed them to be at a more relaxed posture, and the fainting stopped. But it was, a very solemn moment, and a little more than a decade later, they're exhuming that body because it was a really controversial thing to bury that soldier in the first place. It turned out to be an Air Force lieutenant. They controversially exhumed him and did match his DNA because it was pretty clear who he was before they did the exhumation. There were enough sleuths who were able to say, look, all the details about this guy, this is going to be Lieutenant Blasey. It raises questions about what the meaning of the tomb was 100 years ago. There was this global movement. France and Britain were the first to do it, to bury unknowns. They buried them on November 11th, 1920. The U.S. followed a year later, November 11th, 1921. I've been to the unknown tomb in Red Square in Moscow. Belgium has it. Italy is. It's a fascinating movement to recognize a single soldier on behalf of all of those who are unknown, and even in some ways, even more fascinating to have dug one of them up and identified them, making clear with the advancements of technology, we're never going to have another unknown soldier. Does that change the meaning of this? And there was a historian I spoke with who said, yeah, absolutely. It challenges sort of that nationalism that feeds into and that is fueled by this recognition of a war hero, an unknown but venerated war hero. At the same time, I talked with a current serving major and the guy who's the president of the Tomb Guards Association. So one of those soldiers who, for the several years of his duty, was to march and stand guard at the tomb. And they said, no, the meaning may not be the same today as it was then, but it is still exceptionally meaningful. The Tomb Guard said that today mothers, widows, and fathers, husbands will still come to them today and say, "You're guarding my son." Of course, that's not their son or daughter in there, but "You're guarding my child. You standing here, you marching back and forth, doing the 21 steps every, like clockwork. You're doing that for my son who is dead in somewhere." It's a really, really stirring and interesting phenomenon. And as I said, if you live in the DC area, go visit it. You can actually stand along the parade route on November 11th. They're reenacting the procession of the body, but go visit it. It's really worthwhile.
It really is. It's a fantastic story, and you did a great job with it. What are you working on now?
So I'm actually working on a story about I'm sure your readers or your listeners are familiar with the $450,000 payments that the Biden administration is negotiating with the American Civil Liberties Union over the migrants who were snared in the family separations as part of the zero tolerance policy back in the Trump era. And so it's fascinating. The size of those payments is obviously strikes a lot of folks the wrong way. But you start digging through, if the government is to make payments at all, there are some precedents for how you make those payments. One of them is, the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, where payments for non-cancer injuries, anything other than the actual economic losses suffered from the wounds or whatever, is capped at $90,000. Another good example is the Japanese Americans who were kicked out of their homes and forced into camps during World War II. 40 years later, 1988, Congress approved a bill President Reagan signed into law that gave them $20,000 payments. In today's money, that'd be about $46,000. So we're talking about paying illegal immigrants who broke the law in order to come here. If you're part of this population, the reason why you were separated from your children is because you were being prosecuted for illegal entry, or in some cases illegal re-entry, but you were being prosecuted criminally for jumping the border. And to be paid 10 times the amount that the Japanese internees were paid for something that began with an illegal act. And of course, the Japanese internees were out of their homes for more than 2 years. Some of them lost everything that they had built back in those homes. And so it really does sort of put into context what the right payment should be, if any.
Wow. Look forward to that story. As always, great to talk to you, Stephen. Thanks. We'll do it again next week.
My pleasure, Andy.
Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Thanks for joining me today, and remember to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. You'll get 24/7 digital access to the Washington Times at 50% off. Again, go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. I'm Andy Parks. Have a great day.